It was a night like no other in Los Angeles. The sky was smothered in a thick orange haze, and the city that never slept now looked like it was suffocating in smoke. The fire had started small, just a spark that was carried by the wind. But by the time it reached the heart of the city, it had grown into a roaring beast, devouring everything in its path. Sirens screamed in the distance, the red and blue lights flickering through the streets, and the smoke twisted into the sky like a living thing. In the chaos, amid the panic and confusion, two people's paths were about to cross in a way neither of them could have imagined. James Carter was no stranger to the darkness of the streets. A black man in his late 20s, he had grown up in the rougher parts of LA. Life had never been easy, and he'd learned quickly to survive in a world that often seemed indifferent to his existence. His calloused hands gripped a shovel as he worked at a small diner that night, helping with the cleanup from a local event. But as soon as he heard the sirens, his instincts kicked in. Something told him that this wasn't just another fire, this was different. This was something far worse. He made his way through the back alley, his heart racing. The air was thick with smoke, and the acrid scent of burning rubber and wood filled his lungs. People were running in all directions, shouting, their faces pale with fear. James moved swiftly, trying to keep his calm, weaving through the crowd as his eyes scanned for any sign of trouble. Then he saw her. Clara Matthews, a white woman in her early 30s, was trapped. She had been walking home from her office a few blocks from the epicenter of the fire when the flames had suddenly engulfed the street. The fire had spread too quickly, cutting off her escape route. Her blonde hair was singed and her face was streaked with ash. She was backed up against a brick wall, her hands shaking as she tried to cover her face from the smoke. Panic had set in, and she couldn't find a way out. James didn't hesitate. The world seemed to freeze around him as he ran toward her. He had no plan, no strategy. He just knew he had to help. "Hey!" he shouted, waving his arms to get her attention. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She barely registered him at first, her mind clouded by smoke and terror. But then something in her shifted, a flicker of hope. She reached out toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, help me. I don't know what to do." Without thinking twice, James grabbed her arm, pulling her into a nearby alley. He kept his head low, urging her to follow him. The flames were closing in, and the heat was unbearable, but James moved with a sense of urgency that was driven by something deeper than fear. "Stay close and don't stop running," he said, through clenched teeth, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to get to the other side of the block. There's a safe zone." Clara nodded, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She had no idea where they were going or how James knew where to lead them, but she didn't care. In that moment, all she could do was trust him. The air grew hotter as they ran. The flames seemed to follow them, licking at their heels, but James was determined. He had seen his fair share of fires in this city, fires that had destroyed neighborhoods, taken lives, but this one was different. It wasn't just the scale or the speed, it was the sheer ferocity. There was something about it that felt personal. As they reached the end of the alley, they were confronted with an even more desperate situation. A fire truck had crashed into a nearby building, blocking their path. The road ahead was completely cut off by a wall of flame. James froze for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the heat on his skin, could hear the crackling of the fire as it closed in around them. He had one choice. They could either go back, risk getting trapped by the fire, or find another way. Without a word, James tugged Clara to the side and led her through another narrow passageway between two buildings. The smoke was thick, and the air burned in their lungs, but they kept moving. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, littered with debris and broken glass. Clara stumbled a few times, but James was always there, his strong hand steadying her, pulling her forward. Just when it seemed like they had no more room to run, James spotted a fire escape on the side of a tall building. It was rusted and old, but it was their only chance. "Climb," he urged, pointing to the ladder. "It's our only way out." Clara hesitated, looking at the ladder with fear. She wasn't sure if it would hold, but the choice was clear. Without another word, she began to climb, her heart pounding in her chest. James followed close behind, each of them focused on the single goal: survival. By the time they reached the rooftop, the fire was roaring below them, devouring the streets and everything in its path.